and welcome to another ILD Community Network podcast. The ILD Community Network represents a groundbreaking collaboration between the Association of Pulmonary Advanced Practice Providers, or APAP, and Rheumatology Advanced Practice Providers, known as RAP. Together, these organizations are committed to advancing multidisciplinary education, fostering collaboration, and improving care for patients living with interstitial lung disease. I'm your host, Kelsey Cramer, coming to you from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the Medical College of Wisconsin. And in today's episode, Advances in IPF Clinical Trials, we'll explore the rapidly evolving landscape of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis research and discuss how emerging clinical trial data may shape the future of patient care. Joining me today is Kristy Delaney, an experienced clinician with expertise in interstitial lung disease and pulmonary fibrosis. Together, we'll review recent advances in IPF clinical trials, examine novel therapeutic targets and investigational approaches, and discuss what these developments may mean for clinicians caring for patients with this progressive and often devastating disease. We'll also explore how advanced practice providers can stay informed about emerging evidence, identify patients who may be appropriate candidates for clinical trials, and prepare for a future in which treatment options for IPF may continue to expand. Hi, Kristy. Thanks for joining us. Let's get started.
Hello.
Okay. So to begin, Kristy, let's start. Many clinicians may be familiar with inhaled treprostinil in PH and ILD, but the new TETON program explored its role in pulmonary fibrosis. Can you explain the scientific rationale for studying inhaled treprostinil in patients with IPF and in PPF?
Well, I can certainly try. I think from everything that I understand about this trial, it really was sparked by the prior trial called the INCREASE trial, which was for PH-ILD or pulmonary hypertension-associated ILD. What they found when they kind of went back and looked at the data after the trial was published is that all these patients with interstitial lung disease actually had an increase in FVC. Once either the patients that were on drug versus placebo or once they enrolled into the open label extension. So once they transitioned from placebo to drug, it also was consistent with showing an increase in FVC. So there was it kind of suggested that there was an anti-fibrotic effect of the inhaled treprostinil, which was very exciting.
That is super exciting. And I know that when we think about FVC for our patients with interstitial lung disease, that's the golden ticket into, preserving their quality of life, their function, and their ability to keep going. So I think that's something that we want to really hone in on when we're looking at these trials.
Yeah.
Before we dive into the results, can you provide an overview of the TETON clinical development program, including key differences between TETON 1 and TETON PPF and the patient population enrolled in each study?
So TETON 1 there's actually 3 TETON trials. There's TETON 1, TETON 2, and TETON PPF. TETON 1 that we're focusing on is the IPF, or the idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis trial for the inhaled treprostinil in the US and Canada. So obviously that's where we are located, and that's the studies that our centers were participating in. TETON 2 is Asia, Europe, and South America, also for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And then the TETON PPF stands for progressive pulmonary fibrosis. It is global. It was in, I think I read, 16 different countries. It is still ongoing, I believe. It has not been published yet. But it is for progressive pulmonary fibrosis of other diagnoses other than IPF. So interstitial lung disease, progressive interstitial lung diseases other than IPF. So there's some autoimmune stuff, some hypersensitivity, pneumonitis, and a really good mix of things in there. As far as the patient population, I don't have numbers and statistics right in front of me, but it's pretty consistent with, from what I understand, with all of the other IPF trials that have been conducted. So average age is probably somewhere around 70-ish, 70, 71. There was like a low, patients had to meet certain criteria in terms of their baseline FVC, their baseline DLCO. Um, Race was universally recognized. They did allow background therapy with the oral anti-fibrotic agents, the two that were approved prior to the study starting. So I think it's a pretty good overview study. It seems consistent with other IPF studies.
Yeah, I found that as well. I thought what was interesting about the TETON inclusion criteria is that they were more liberal with folks that were on oxygen. And I think that the FVC was generally a little bit lower than what the general population was in the Impulses trial, which was that landmark trial that got us approved for nintedanib 14 in 2014.
Mhm.
So these patients were a little sicker than that initial Impulses trial when we're thinking about anti-fibrotic therapy. Those folks had a little bit of a lower FVC, and not as many of them were on oxygen. And I think in the TETON study, there were almost 80% of 75% of people who were on oxygen, and the average FVC was at 74%. So I think when we then step forward and start talking about the outcome data, I think it's even more impressive because these folks were sicker
Mm.
than when we're comparing to the Impulses trial of nintedanib in 2014.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, also when it comes to thinking about patients that I want to put on an inhaled treprostinil, I really liked that in the PPF trial, they allowed folks to be on immune suppressing medications because so many of our autoimmune patients are already on steroids and they're on, mycophenolate or azathioprine.
Yeah.
And this was helpful for me in guiding patient selection in the future because the recent Fibroneer study that looked at progressive pulmonary fibrosis in their anti-fibrotic study, they excluded folks who are on mycophenolate
Yeah.
as well as
I think rituximab was excluded.
I think it was rituximab too. Yeah. So this allows me to interpret this data and not be questioning like, oh, which progressive pulmonary fibrosis patient should I put on, even though they're on background immune suppressing medications. Sometimes for a clinician that can give you pause. And I feel like this, because of how
Yeah.
open their inclusion criteria was, I feel less reserved in making that decision. Is kind of how I feel like
Mhm.
when I put it into clinical practice.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I hadn't compared it side by side to the Impulses trial. It is interesting. I can't remember what the oxygen stipulations were for that trial, but for a lot of trials, they can only be on something like 4 liters per minute, and this one, I believe it was up to 10.
I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'm sure you have the same um like patients, Christy, but my patients want to stay off of oxygen as long as they can. So if I can
Oh,
tell
yeah.
them, and this doesn't necessarily show that, but if I can tell them like, hey, this medication is going to keep you off oxygen a little bit longer, that's a huge quality of life benefit for our patients. Okay, so let's move into efficacy. What were some of the top line efficacy findings from TETON, and how should clinicians interpret the impact on lung function and disease progression?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest point is that it reduces that rate of decline of FVC. So it can be in the group on or not on background therapy. So it helped to kind of preserve that lung function for longer. It actually also, and I know we'll probably touch on this a little bit later. It delayed that worsening point, that kind of first clinical worsening as well. And so it kind of preserved that, it kind of kept like a steady line or I guess you could call it a plateau in lung function for longer in the treatment group than in the placebo group. We start seeing a branch in those lines on the graph between that 4 and 8 week mark. But patients still got worse, but they got less worse on the inhaled treprostinil. So we know that IPF is a horrible disease. It's a progressive disease, no matter what way you spin it. And so far, we have very limited options. And so now it's like, well, we have another option. So we have an option that works independently, and we have an option that works concurrently with our existing FDA-approved anti-fibrotic agents, which is great. It's a great option for clinicians and patients because it can be used for add-on therapy. It can be used for people who don't tolerate therapy. I mean, there's just so many things to think about there. But I think just knowing that it does help to preserve FEC. One thing I thought was really interesting when I was looking at this study is that the rate of decline, the volume of lung volume loss, essentially, in the arm not on background therapy was smallest. I think I'm phrasing this correctly. I hope I am anyway. So there was a greater in the placebo arm, for example, on background therapy versus not on background therapy. There was more FVC decline in the background therapy arm, both of them, the nintedanib and the pirfenidone arms. I don't know if you noticed that. And my thought is, I don't think it was powered for this, but my thought is that likely the patients that are on background therapy probably have more advanced disease than the patients who aren't already on background therapy. So that was kind of my takeaway for that as well.
I totally agree. I think as more and more antifibrotics come to market, we're seeing that the studies are sampling a sicker population, because those are the ones who are invested in making sure that their lung function doesn't decline and that they're involved in these studies. And I think there was a similar finding, Kristy, in the FIBRONEER study, and that those folks that were on placebo for the nintedanib, or sorry, placebo for the nerandomilast, but were on background therapy like pirfenidone or nintedanib, still had an FVC decline. So I think 100% you're right. We're just seeing a sicker population, and the disease, like you said, is so horrible, and it continues to progress for these folks. So beyond the primary endpoint, were there any secondary or exploratory outcomes from the TETON program that you found particularly clinically meaningful or noteworthy?
I kind of touched on this just a bit ago, but I think that delay to that clinical worsening, it did show a difference in that time to clinical worsening. So I think when I look at the graph, it looks like it's probably about the 28-week mark, which is what, 6 months or so. It looks like people stayed stable, had a little bit of FVC improvement initially, and then kind of stayed stable for quite some time before they did start to have that expected decline again. So that was interesting. And then the fact that it doesn't show any difference with preventing ILD exacerbations or death. So it did not, unfortunately, it just didn't show that it provided any benefit in those areas.
I think that was disappointing, but I think realistic. I think that the FIBRONEER study initially didn't meet their secondary endpoints, but I think in the extension data, they started to see some secondary endpoints in terms of clinical worsening and death. So I wonder if, as the TETON extension data continues to be collected, if they will see additional wins for our IPF and our PPF patients.
And it'll be interesting if there's a difference between the two.
Yeah. Safety is always an important consideration when introducing a new therapy. What did the TETON studies tell us about safety and tolerability of inhaled treprostinil in the IPF and PPF patient populations?
So it tells us, so my big takeaway is it's safe to use for our patients. Some of the other things that have been studied in our patients have shown actual worsening because of probably a O2 mismatch kind of thing. So it does show that it's safe. It's safe independently. It's safe to be used in conjunction with anti-fibrotic therapy. We'll see how the PPF study, what it comes out at. But like you had said earlier, alluded to earlier, it looks like it's going to be safe with immunomodulatory agents. And then I think as far as tolerability, cough is just the biggest thing. And so I think we're just going to really have to aggressively mitigate cough symptoms. I don't know what you've done. So we've been using inhaled treprostinil already with our PH-ILD patients, right? So we have some experience with this medication already in our population, and cough has been always the biggest thing or the biggest hurdle or the hardest thing to mitigate. Um, most of our patients have a chronic cough, and it can really impact their quality of life, their partner's quality of life, their sleep, all of these things. And so really just trying to say, okay, do we need to do some nebulized albuterol ahead of time? Do we need to use, we use a lot of morphine in our patients for cough suppressant. Like what do we do? How do we get these people to tolerate this medication so that they can continue it so that it can have benefit?
I think what I found so interesting was that there was a, a bigger dropout rate in the TETON trials compared to the increase trial. The TETON trial was a 52-week trial, and increase was a 16-week. So I think with the extended time in this trial, they saw greater dropout, and I think a lot of that was driven by those adverse side effects like cough. And then obviously some folks with headache and diarrhea were also noted in the safety profile for this medication. But I think you're right, Kristy. Cough is so impactful for these folks because it hits them all day long. Um, and sometimes we can mitigate that cough with inhalation techniques and making sure that inhalation techniques are appropriate, or using like taking a scoop of peanut butter before you inhale your treprostinil is what every, nurse will tell me. But at the end of the day, it seems like this cough is so persistent. Even with patients who have interstitial lung disease and fibrosis at a baseline, cough is one of their biggest symptoms. I really wonder how this trial data will then be extended to other inhaled treprostinil agents that are on the market that seem to advertise less side effects. If people will then pull this data and say, okay, it's applicable to all inhaled treprostinil agents, and think about that in terms of side effect profile of medications that are on the market.
Have you seen much difference between the DPI and the nebulized therapies in your groups?
No, well, we definitely try both versions of the medications for folks to see which one they can tolerate it, and it seems like it's more based on the patient. Um, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, I would say the same. I do think that, just dry powder inhalers sometimes are harder. I think they're easier for our patients in terms of accessibility and being able to be on the go and things like that. But um, I do think that some of our patients with more severe cough prefer the nebulized treatment. So I think we'll just have to see over time how it plays out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go on to the next question. Many patients with IPF are already receiving anti-fibrotic therapy. Based on the available data, how should clinicians think about inhaled treprostinil in the context of existing treatment strategies? Are we potentially talking about replacement strategies or more of a layering approach?
I think it can be either, and I think it's going to depend on a large number of factors, and probably some patient preference as well. I think, it's showing that it can be used independently. It can be used in conjunction or as add-on therapy, concurrently with antifibrotics. I don't believe because nerandomilast was not FDA approved prior to this trial, it has not been studied with it. I can't imagine that the data would be any different, but it is a different class of medication, so I do think it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out in the long run. I I think that it can certainly be add-on therapy for people that are progressing, absolutely. I'm not sure. I think it will also be determined by how it ends up being processed by insurance companies because we're all ruled by them. We fight them every day. Um, which is frustrating, but it's just the God's honest truth, right? So I think that, but for patients that are intolerant of all of the oral anti-fibrotic agents, I think it's another option, which is great. I think the inconvenience of 4 times a day is potentially a minor inconvenience, but it's a 4 times a day medicine. I would need an alarm to remember a medicine 4 times a day. And so some people are good at that and some people aren't, and some people don't want to deal with that. So I think that's where that patient preference comes in. If someone, wants wants to try it. Um, so
I think up until maybe a year or two ago, when our antifibrotic agents that were available were nintedanib and pirfenidone, I would sometimes be hesitant to start an antifibrotic because the side effect profiles with those medications were so limiting, and I didn't want to impact a patient's quality of life in terms of the side effects of those two antifibrotics. But now with nerandomilast on the market, as well as an inhaled treprostinil targeting the FVC preservation for these for these ILD patients, I think at a baseline we know that all ILD patients have a antifibrotic medication that's available, and so um, we should be treating with the therapies that are available and just making sure that we have a patient on at least one. Seems like the standard of care. And 100%, you're right. I know right now, like getting insurance to approve an antifibrotic, they've got a list, right? You've got to go through X, Y, and Z before you can get to the new novel antifibrotic. So you're right. Insurance is going to dictate how we add it on, for sure.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes of that.
If inhaled treprostinil ultimately becomes incorporated into the treatment landscape for IPF or PPF, which patients do you think are most likely to benefit, and what practical considerations should we be aware of when identifying potential candidates?
I think we probably just kind of answered this, but I think definitely like every single patient with IPF needs to be on an antifibrotic. What antifibrotic is still to be determined. Like you said, like we just talked about, like I think some of it's going to be dictated by insurance, but every patient should be on an antifibrotic. I think in terms of who is going to be a candidate for the inhaled treprostinil, from what anyone should be a candidate. Because we know that it slows down that rate of decline and it preserves that, time to clinical worsening. And so, I think any patient with IPF would benefit from it. Now, I do think that it showed the patients that had both oral antifibrotic and inhaled did show less worsening. And so I think, especially these patients with progressive disease that we're seeing that progression, I think that's when we need to really be aggressive at starting this earlier in that decline, really trying to get it approved and get patients started on it and advocate for an add-on therapy, for sure. Um, I think the patients that are going to be really hard to manage on it are patients with really significant underlying cough. So, we have patients with bronchiectasis as well. Our patients with CPFE or combined pulmonary fibrosis and emphysema with, a lot of cough. I think those are going to be probably the most challenging patients just because of side effects. Um, and then our patients that are, on nintedanib with some underlying diarrhea, if there's, with the diarrhea side effect, just to kind of see how that goes. But I think the patients with the underlying significant cough are probably going to be our biggest challenge.
I think, like you had mentioned, Kristy, in this patient population, but also in this study, when we review like the Fibroneer data, the Impulsus data, and now the TETON data, all these patients still have FVC decline, and at the end of the day, a preserved FVC is going to hold off death, right? Decline in FVC eventually will lead to more morbidity and mortality, and we know that. So I'm really interested to see in the future if there are studies that look at if we can get patients on triple anti-fibrotic therapy, do we actually see a preservation of FVC and holding off some of those secondary endpoints that we're also interested in, like clinical worsening or mortality. And so I think that's going to be the next step, because at the end of the day, we're still seeing a progressive disease, and that's impacting our patients' livelihoods.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's exciting to think of the possibilities. I think we're at the tip of the iceberg, really, with IPF. I think more and more is coming out. I think there's more research being done. There's more drugs in trial that are showing some promise, and you know, so far we still have yet to find a reversal agent, right? And so I know there's some exciting things potentially coming down the pipeline, but yeah, can this be studied, like you said, as triple therapy? We haven't even seen data, or I haven't seen data anyway, with even this in nerandomilast. I don't, it just hasn't been out long enough. The nerandomilast hasn't been out long enough to study it. So it will be really interesting to see over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, which is short time span, are we going to see some of this? I don't think I don't know that a study has been set up for triple therapy yet, but hopefully that's in the works.
Looking ahead, what do you believe are the most important implications of the TETON program for future management of IPF and progressive pulmonary fibrosis? And then what are some key takeaways our listeners should bring back to their clinical practice?
Yeah, I think just the bottom line is it's another option. It's another option that has much less GI side effects, right? It has some diarrhea, but not near the extent of, the oral anti-fibrotics, and it seems to be fairly well tolerated, other than, cough. But I think it's another option, which is exciting for our patients and much needed.
And my only add-on would be I start to get nervous about the bandwidth of some of our advanced lung disease programs. I know that we are limited in terms of RN coordinators, the ones that are actually doing the legwork and getting these medications approved with prior authorizations. And also with funding that's available, come January, when everybody's, funding has to be renewed for these therapies, is there a limited funding available? And if I've got patients who have 2 or 3 advanced pH medications plus now 2 or 3 anti-fibrotic medications, that's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And is the money out there to make sure that these patients can stay on these therapies long term?
Yeah, that's a very valid point.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the ILD Community Network Podcast. We hope today's discussion provided valuable insights into the evolving landscape of IPF clinical trials and PPF clinical trials, and highlighted how emerging therapies and novel treatment approaches may shape the future of care for our patients living with ILD and IPF. A special thanks to our guest, Kristy, for sharing her expertise and perspectives on the latest development in IPF research. And just so that you all know, the ILD Community Network is a collaborative initiative of APAP and RAP dedicated to advancing multidisciplinary education and improving outcomes for patients living with interstitial lung disease. To access additional educational resources, podcasts, and expert insight, and community-focused programming, be sure to visit the ILD Community Network website at ildcommunitynetwork.org. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your colleagues, and continue to join us for future discussions as we continue to explore the latest advances in ILD research and patient care. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.